It's my pleasure to introduce Katie Young. Katie did her DPhil at Oxford before moving to UCLA for her postdoc. The postdoc was on brain, motivation, personality, and risk and resilience to depression and anxiety in youth and adolescents. I just walked upstairs and I'm out of breath. Like, why is that harder to get out? After her postdoc, she moved to King's College London for a lectureship, and she was shortly after that awarded a Brain and Behaviour Foundation Fellowship, where she was looking at treatment mechanisms and anxiety and depression, amongst other things. Most recently, she launched the RAMP project, which she will be speaking to us about today. The RAMP is this longitudinal study looking at mental health in a large cohort in the UK. For this project, she was actually awarded one of 3 MQ fellowships, which she's going to discuss some of the research and what they were aiming to do in this project here. And really looking forward to hearing all about your talk, Katie. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I was just saying earlier how much of a novelty it is to be at an in-person meeting and not speaking into the void. So I'm really excited to be here and always love visiting. So yeah, hopefully today I'll take you through some of the work we've been doing about, sorry.
Sorry to interrupt.
No.
Do you think we could get you to share the slides in Zoom as well? Forgot to ask you.
Oh, yes. How do I do that?
I think that works at the same time.
Okay. A screen share, is that what? Okay.
Yes.
That one? Okay. That's yeah, one thing we've all learned to do better during the pandemic, right? All this tech. Great, so yeah, I'm going to be talking today a little bit about some of the work we've been doing about mental health during the pandemic in these big cohort studies in the UK, as Christine mentioned. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some analyses that we're fairly happy with and fairly settled on, and as well as some newer stuff that's kind of all finished running within the last week or so. So it's a little more up in the air, and I'd be delighted to hear any of your thoughts or questions about what we've been up to. So just a bit of an overview for today. I'm going to give a little intro on stress, depression, and anxiety, and why we think it's an important time to be studying stress for mental health. I'll give an intro then to the RAMP study and also another study called Coping. I'll get into all the frustrating acronyms that I'll be introducing today. And then our 2 main research questions, the first of which is, who is at greatest risk for worsening mental health during the pandemic? And then secondly, what predicts longer term trajectories of symptom change? So starting with stress, depression, and anxiety. This is a slide I probably don't need to keep saying to people, but of course, as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a chronic sort of population level stressor. Various aspects of the pandemic make it a particularly salient stressor. Of course, it involves a threat, in this case, the risk of contracting COVID-19, and that being a threat either to yourself or to others. It's an uncertain situation, so it's been a very unpredictable and constantly changing experience for all of us, which again adds to the salience of the stressor. And finally, it's a novel stressor. It's not something we've had prior experience with dealing on this scale, so again, adding to the salience. At the same time, as we know, there's been disruption to a lot of our normal coping strategies of how we normally deal and adapt with stress. There's in particular been a loss of social support. I think in the UK, we perhaps had some more severe restrictions on social contact than maybe here in Denmark, you know, with people being confined to their homes a lot more. Of course, we've all experienced disruptions to our routines, working from home, you know, normal life just not being normal anymore. And then the sort of third aspect is a reduced access to health promoting activities, whether that's healthcare services or our kind of normal recreational activities and exercise, all the things that we normally do to try and maintain sort of healthy well-being. So there's a lot of different ways, of course, we can conceptualize stress, and we can think about how stress affects the body and the mind in a lot of different ways. My background is in psychology, and I'm really focused on kind of cognitive processes. So I like a cognitive model of how stress might lead to greater symptoms of anxiety or depression. And here we're actually going back to Beck's original model, which is the foundation of cognitive behavioral therapy, thinking about how our thoughts, our feelings and our behaviors all interact with one another. And so in Becks model, stress plays a critical role in terms of activating some of our maladaptive core beliefs that we might have. So to take you through this flowchart, Beck believes that we all sort of carry around with us a certain set of core beliefs, things that we believe about the world or about ourselves. A lot of the time, these can be kind of latent, sort of in the background, but perhaps when we experience a stressor or a critical incident, we are challenged in some ways, and this activates some of these core beliefs. And in a maladaptive way, this can start to influence our trains of thought, the ways we're feeling, and the ways that we're starting to act. So an example here, I think, maybe makes things a bit clearer. Say I carry around with myself a core belief that maybe I'm a difficult person to get along with. Maybe a lot of the time that doesn't really influence how I'm getting along in the world, but say I have a critical incident. I have an argument with a close friend. This really activates this core belief that I have that I am a difficult person. And in Beck's model, the first thing that would happen is a train of negative automatic thoughts. So my first thought is that, it reactivates this belief that I'm a difficult person, but I might then escalate this series of thoughts thinking, I'm a difficult person, I'm going to lose this friendship, I'm never going to make new friends, I'm going to be lonely. So this sort of negative automatic thought pattern, without really much conscious effort, we end up in this sort of catastrophizing mindset. And this can influence our emotions, of course. It would start to affect our mood, maybe increase our levels of anxiety, and influence our behavior as well. I might try to engage in excessive kind of reassurance seeking to make sure that, I can salvage this friendship, or I might retreat from future friendships and future interactions as well in a self-protective way. So this is, Beck's cognitive model of how stress and the experience of additional stressors might exacerbate our risk for anxiety or depression. Of course, we all experience stressors in our lives, and not all of us go on to develop maladaptive patterns of thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. So one of the things we're really interested in learning more about is who is at greater risk for getting into one of these bad repetitive patterns, and how can we help people to break these patterns. So I've been talking about stress kind of generally, and that's really my view on a lot of the work that we've been doing is not necessarily that this is pandemic specific stress that we're experiencing. The stressors that I described, of course, are particular to this context, but in my view, I don't think the way that we're responding to stress is particularly different across different contexts. And so one of the benefits of looking at stress during the pandemic is that we can start to think about stress more generally in a way that is affecting a lot of people in a very similar way. So one of the real challenges of stress research typically is that stressors are, by their very nature, idiosyncratic. The types of things that happen to us unexpectedly and cause us stress and anxiety are different for each of us. But during the pandemic, we have broadly experienced this big stressor on a relatively consistent time frame, at least within an individual country. And so we can start to think about a more coherent stressor and look, sort of take out that idiosyncratic aspect of the stress. We've also been fortunate in our work to have access to large cohorts of participants. So we've been able to examine effects at quite a large scale. And excuse me, I'll be talking quite a bit today about one particular sample called the Genetic Links to Anxiety and Depression study, which is a large cohort of individuals with pre-existing diagnoses of anxiety and depression. The other benefit for us in the types of data we were collecting is that we used a repeated assessment design. So from very early on in the pandemic, we started collecting data every 2 weeks. We've relaxed that time frame a little bit as the situation evolved, but we do have quite high temporal precision in our data, which is challenging, I think, to get in a normal observational study. And I think one of the, the benefits of studying something kind of timely during the pandemic is that people are interested. We've been able to have quite a large cohort of participants who've been really engaged and continuing to complete their surveys, even though we're not able to reimburse them for their time. So there's a few ways that this is kind of an unusual data set for us. The primary limitation, of course, is that it's very tempting to talk about the impact of the pandemic on mental health, But going back to basic study design, without a control group, we can't really talk about impact. So we can see all these things that are happening during the pandemic, but we don't have a control group of people who weren't affected by the pandemic. So a limitation to always bear in mind. So moving on to tell you a little bit about the studies we've been running. So there are a few acronyms, and I apologize for that, but please bear with me. So our two main studies are called RAMP and Coping. RAMP is the Repeated Assessment of Mental Health in Pandemic Study. Coping is the COVID-19 Psychiatry and Neurological Genetics Study. The names are largely irrelevant. The studies are very similar. They differ only in the populations that we're assessing. So they're both online questionnaire-based studies for obvious reasons during the pandemic. RAMP was a novel participant recruitment that we began in April 2020, mostly recruited via social media. Coping is the version of the same study that utilized pre-existing cohorts. So we contacted participants who were members of the NIHR bioresource, which is a huge resource in the UK of over 100,000 individuals actually, which in itself is broken down into a number of different cohorts. One of the cohorts within the NIHR bioresource is the genetic links to anxiety and depression study. So around 40,000 people in total who had previously been characterized in terms of their mental health. They completed surveys and questionnaires prior to the pandemic, and they're individuals that we know had a pre-existing diagnosis of an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder, or both. One final acronym, and then I'm done. The coping study itself is broken down, as I mentioned, into these various different cohorts. For the purposes of today, I'm going to talk about this GLAD, genetic links to anxiety and depression cohort, and all the other cohorts we're lumping together and calling NBR, the National Bioresource. These are groups that were collected for lots of different disease types, liver disease, kidney disease, things like that. So they're effectively a bit of a control group, although of course they could be experiencing mental health problems as well. Okay, so our study timeline, this is a slide I have updated every single time I've given this talk. This is just our first year of data collection. You can see we launched RAMP and Coping relatively close to one another back in April 2020. These gray bars are our different assessment time points. So you can see initially we were collecting data every 2 weeks. From August onwards, we reduced to monthly, and we collected monthly data up until April 2021. We're still continuing. I'll tell you now in a little bit about what we're still doing with these participants, but this is kind of the core of the data I'm going to be talking about today. And I've just sort of highlighted here the various periods of lockdown and relatively eased restrictions in the UK. So I know it's differed a lot across countries, but for us, we were in a fairly severe lockdown until kind of June, July 2020, eased restrictions over the summer. We had a mini lockdown around November to December, a few weeks off and a little bit of chaos, and then our big second wave lockdown from January. In terms of the measures that we have, so we've been looking at a lot of different domains. These are sort of the main categories, obviously thinking about demographic factors, a range of different mental health measures. My focus is on depression and anxiety, but we have a lot of other symptom scales included as well. A number of different cognitive factors, thinking about types of thought patterns that might influence how you respond in one way or another. Certain behavioral factors, which of course trying to be a bit sensitive to how behaviors change during the pandemic. So thinking about self-care, but also about behaviors that might be more specific to the pandemic context. And then in collaboration with some physical health colleagues, we're also been collecting data on neurological and respiratory symptoms to look at potential interactions between mental and physical health. Yes.
What are some examples of the pandemic behaviors?
Pandemic behaviors. Yeah, we had a range of different questions here that were sort of developed a bit on the fly. Our full link actually here is on the OSF if you'd like to take a look. But they include things like how have you been interacting with other people? Have you been, meeting up in parks or socializing online or, engaging in what other things we have? Some of them are health related. So how much have you been following government guidelines? How much have you been sort of spending time on social media? It's a range of things, things like that. Yeah. So in terms of our sample size, in RAMP we have around 9,000 individuals, in coping around 25,000 in total. And I'm just mapping here where they are based in the UK, and for reference, the general UK population density. So we were surprised at sort of the geographical distribution that we managed to achieve through sort of fairly passive social media advertising. So people from Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, as well as our kind of more typical denser population in the south of England.
That's amazing. That's right. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, we thought there was a bug at first. That's how we were not convinced, but yeah, even up in the Highlands.
That was doing that. I mean, were you doing any kind of active push to get it out that far?
So coping was, our pre-existing cohorts, but in RAMP, no, it was largely social media based, some sort of kind of organic posting through social media, right. Some paid social media advertising as well, which sort of, runs on these slightly scary algorithms of trying to optimize who's most likely to click on this link. So we also thought, being a study run out of London, we might end up with a very London-centric population, but really not. It worked remarkably well. Yeah.
And do you have any idea whether any particular of these initiatives were pushing it more than others, or was it just like everything adding in a little bit to the inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I think the paid advertising, right. It just increases the volume and the amount that people are seeing it. We were fortunate to work with a company who make quite slick adverts as right. well. So we had, short videos that were kind of really well suited, I think, to social media, and we got lucky with those things kind of all coming together kind of at the right time, I think.
You get valuable money when you advertise with Facebook, right?
You do, yeah. It's, as I'll show you in a second, not necessarily the most representative population for other factors, sure. But certainly in terms of sample size, it really worked well for us, yeah. Take you through a few other demographic factors so you get a sense of our population. This is now broken down into the GLAD cohort, the rest of NBR and the RAMP study as well. So a pretty decent distribution across age, with a slightly younger group amongst the GLAD study, which was something we kind of knew about this cohort already. In terms of gender, you probably wouldn't be surprised to know that it's a predominantly female sample. This seems to happen every time we advertise for a mental health study online. We just get more women responding than men. Slightly better balanced in the NBR cohorts. They're recruited in a slightly different way, and obviously not focused on mental health either. Looking at ethnicity, we do have a pretty poor representation of minority ethnic groups in our sample. It was something we actually spent quite a lot of time trying to optimize within our advertising. So again, for reference, the UK national estimates of minority ethnic groups, we have relatively low representation across all of these groups. So definitely a challenge in terms of this type of recruitment and these types of studies. And then looking at mental health diagnoses, you can really see kind of the difference in the cohorts here. The GLAD sample in yellow are the individuals that we know have a history of anxiety or depressive disorders, and some other kind of comorbid or co-occurring disorders as well. The National Bioresource sample then make up the majority of our no diagnosis sample, although of course many have had experiences of mental health problems in the past. And then our RAMP study, which was this social media advertising, we did seem to get a sort of overrepresented sample of people who had pre-existing mental health conditions, which I think makes sense. Again, if you're advertising a mental health study, you're more likely to recruit it to be of interest to people who've had some experiences like that in the past. Finally, just employment status. I'll talk a little bit about this and some of the demographic factors we've been looking at, but we were interested particularly in terms of whether people in less secure financial situations, so students or people who are unemployed, might be at elevated risk given all the economic uncertainty around the pandemic as well. So a decent amount of representation across each of these samples for these factors too. So to get a little bit into some of the data, our first question, of course, was, does mental health change during the pandemic? And I'll talk a little bit about that as in relation to a measurement issue that we came across and some slightly surprising findings. for us, as well as for various reviewers that we've encountered so far. And I'll talk a little bit about some of our regression models that we've been running to look at amongst people who have experienced symptom change, who's at elevated risk. So this is our first kind of most surprising finding during the pandemic. So these are plots of within our GLAD sample now, so people who we had mental health data on before the pandemic, labeled here as pre-pandemic, and during the pandemic. So this is sort of April, May time point, the first time point within the pandemic study. We see really very little overall change in symptoms. So this is the PHQ-9 for our depression scale, the GAD-7 for anxiety, and the PCL-6 for PTSD symptoms. And you can see there are, in depression and anxiety, very marginal overall decreases and a very marginal overall increase in PTSD. Of course, with this kind of sample size, these are statistically significant. But in terms of thinking about a clinically meaningful change, you'd be looking at 4 or 5 points on any of these scales before you would start to move categories at all. So something very surprising, I think, given all the rhetoric and the discussion around the pandemic, and something that we've sort of really been digging into a little more, thinking about why it is that we sort of have this general sense that there's been this mental health epidemic during the pandemic, which doesn't seem to be represented in our data. I'm going to return to that just in a second, but yes, sorry.
You said that the during pandemic was the measurement at the first time point?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so people did vary in terms of when they did their first assessment, but the majority were in late April, early May 2020. Yeah. Yep, so I'll return to that measurement issue, but of course, when we look at overall means, this isn't the whole picture. Just because the mean is very small, we know that lots of people were experiencing worsening of symptoms, and many people are also experiencing an improvement in symptoms. So the next thing we went on to do was to run a series of regression analyses looking at what demographic factors might predict risk for worsening or resilience or improvement, however you want to phrase that, in terms of symptoms over this period. So this is just some details on the analyses run. We looked at a few key demographic factors: pre-existing mental health diagnoses, gender, age, ethnicity, and employment status. For all of these models, we are looking at symptom change by controlling for pre-pandemic symptom levels. So I'll just go into the slide and talk you through that now. Oh, I changed my slides, never mind. I'll tell you about it now. So yeah, rather than looking at change scores and trying to predict change, what we've done is just include pre-pandemic symptom severity in all of our models. So we're accounting for the variance associated with your mental health history, and now looking for additional variance explained by any of these demographic factors. So these are our results, first of all, in terms of prior mental health or neurodevelopmental diagnoses. For all of these plots, I'm sure you're probably familiar, but anything to the right-hand side of the dashed line indicates a risk for worsening symptoms. Anything to the left indicates likelihood of reduced symptoms. And where the error bars don't overlap with the dashed line, that's something that's statistically significant. So first of all, looking at people who had a comorbid depression and anxiety diagnosis prior to the pandemic, these individuals showed a greater risk for worsening depression, anxiety, and PTSD symptoms. Amongst those with just a depressive disorder diagnosis, we see a kind of specific effect only in terms of worsening symptoms of depression. And then surprisingly, for those who just had an anxiety disorder, we didn't see any statistically significant effects. So you can follow this down for the rest of the plot. We see, worsening sort of general mental health symptoms amongst people with eating disorders and obsessive compulsive disorder. Also for those who had pre-existing diagnosis of PTSD. Some effects amongst individuals who had autism spectrum disorder, and some effects amongst those with personality disorders as well. So overall, a prior mental health diagnosis does seem to be putting you at elevated risk for worsening symptoms during these early months of the pandemic. Looking at demographic factors, we found an effect of female gender only for symptoms of PTSD and anxiety, not an effect on depression here. And really quite a striking age effect. So our 16 to 25-year-olds are showing elevated risk for all types of symptoms shown here. whereas those in older age groups are actually more likely to show a decrease in symptoms. And this is in comparison to a sort of 26 to 35-year-old reference age group here. Looking at effects of ethnicity, in our sample, we don't, or in our cohorts, we don't see a significant effect of minority ethnic group. You will see that the confidence intervals here, of course, are really wide. We have, as I mentioned, a lower representation amongst these groups. So it's something that the other cohorts have done a better job at looking at, although it's, you know, a limitation for many of us. And then again, I mentioned about the employment status. We do seem to see an effect of those who are in an unstable financial situation, particularly those who are unemployed, showing a greater risk for worsening depression, PTSD, and anxiety symptoms. So I wanted to spend a little time now telling you this about this measurement issue that we encountered, and returning to this idea about, you know, there's this kind of wide-held belief and in the media and across a lot of cross-sectional studies talking about the, you know, mental health impact of the pandemic. When we did our literature review looking at other longitudinal studies, the picture didn't seem to be quite as clear as we certainly thought it would be, and many other people are discussing. So some studies are showing slightly elevated mental health symptoms. This is sort of one of the largest UK samples describing elevated mental distress, which of course is a little bit different to thinking about, you know, heightened depression or heightened anxiety. This tends to be a slightly more general sort of well-being, psychological distress type measure. Other cohorts are showing increased anxiety, but not depression. There's a Dutch study showing increased depression, but not anxiety. And then others showing no particular changes. So this became quite of an obsession for us. You know, we were sort of talking to people and trying to understand what's going on. And, you know, there's a lot of widespread reporting of this elevated distress, but it doesn't seem to be consistent for different longitudinal studies. We had actually used in, coincidentally, and kind of in our design, we looked at changes in mental health in a few different ways. So I've talked so far about objective changes in symptom severity from before the pandemic to during the pandemic. We also asked people to rate how different their feelings were to how they felt before the pandemic. So you complete your PHQ-9 depression scale, you rate your current symptoms, and then we ask you, okay, how different is this to how you felt before? And here we sort of see the opposite picture, right? We see over 50% reporting that their symptoms feel worse now than they did before the pandemic. About 40% saying no change, and 6 or 7% acknowledging a slight improvement in symptoms. So this really doesn't match what we're seeing in the objective scales. So the third way that we asked was to ask people how severe they remember their symptoms being prior to the pandemic. So you complete your current scale of how my depression symptoms are right now. We then ask you, does this feel different? If you say, yes, it does feel different, we ask you, okay, how were your symptoms before? So in our GLAD cohort, so these people who had pre-pandemic symptom measures, we actually have three types of data assessment. We have objective pre-pandemic measures, which are the ones I showed you here in yellow. We have their current baseline shown in green, and we have this retrospective estimate, which is what I'm showing you now here in pink. And here we do see quite a dramatic effect of people remembering that their symptoms prior to the pandemic were less severe than they actually were. This again took us a little time to get your head around, because you think, you know, in depression or anxiety, you have this cognitive bias, you think, you know, maybe things are worse than they were. It seemed strange to us to think that actually we don't remember how bad our symptoms objectively were in the past. But maybe this does explain part of this discrepancy. If we don't remember our symptoms being as bad as they actually were, and right now we think that our symptoms are at this level, well, we must have experienced a worsening. This might explain why we see this psychological distress. Things have gotten much worse. Whereas actually, if we look objectively, we're maybe attributing more of our current psychological distress to what's happening in the pandemic. Although overall, we haven't seen this dramatic shift in symptom severity. One last comparison for you, and then I promise I'll move on. We also looked at kind of the comparison of our retrospective and prospective anxiety and depression scores, and looked at individual differences within these as well. How much do they actually relate to one another? you know, maybe the overall levels are not particularly comparable, but can we still use this as an effective predictor of change? So here I'm highlighting the correspondence between prospective and retrospective anxiety. It's a correlation of about 0.5, which is obviously significant, but certainly not the whole picture. And for depression, it's closer to 0.6, but still a lot of variance unexplained. Kind of notably, these correlations are lower than the sort of concurrent anxiety depression correlation, which is more around 0.7. Finally, then, we did run all of our models using retrospective symptom estimates rather than our prospective symptom estimates in terms of our regressions. And you can see here that the prospective pre-pandemic measure is a slightly better predictor of current symptoms than the retrospective. But in terms of thinking about any of these demographic predictors, we do see largely similar pattern of effects. So these green and yellow dots seem to be kind of following the same general pattern. So even though we can't necessarily rely on retrospective estimates for an exact change in symptoms, we can still use this type of data quite effectively to predict which groups of individuals might be at elevated risk. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to our newer analyses. I'm happy to answer any questions about that, or we can, any questions at the end as well. But I'd love to show you some of this newer data and see what you think about it. So as I mentioned, we have actually continued to follow up these participants. We're in the process now of our long-term follow-up, which is scheduled to end in April 2022. Fingers crossed that we will no longer be relevant at that point. And so we're now conducting assessments every 12 weeks. So all in all, we'll have 2 years worth of data to model. What we'll be looking at so far is modeling just our first year of data. And we've been looking at trajectories of symptom change over time. All of these analyses, I should say, were run by Kirsten Purvis, who's a postdoc working on this project as well. And what we've been looking at is sets of analyses that sort of fall within the category of group-based trajectory modeling. So here we're trying to use a data-driven approach to think about how trajectories and patterns of change vary across the pandemic. So this would just be an example here, but we can think about patterns of symptom change in lots of different ways. We could have, in this example, a high stable symptom group, a low stable group, one that's showing an increase or one that's showing a decrease over time. And this is what's really of interest to us in terms of thinking about these individual risks. We want to know, not just who's showing an initial worsening in anxiety and depression, but who's showing this kind of sustained chronic trajectory. And what are the different types of patterns of symptom change as well. So these types of analyses are kind of data-driven approaches that tell us what are the patterns of symptom change over time, how many people fall within each of these different types of trajectories, and also what sorts of predictors predict whether you're going to be on a worsening trajectory or a low stable trajectory over time. So we've been running these analyses on general symptom scales of depression and anxiety. But we've also been looking specifically at symptoms of anhedonia. Before the pandemic, my research focus was on symptoms of anhedonia, which are defined as the loss of interest or pleasure in previously enjoyed activities. And it's a symptom of depression, as well as a range of other psychological disorders that's not often studied in terms of treatment research. So it was a particular focus for me in terms of thinking about how can we use the neuroscience or our various understandings of anhedonia to improve treatment response. And so anhedonia is defined as the loss of interest or pleasure in previously enjoyed activities. And this felt to us very relevant during the pandemic. At the time when you can't go to your favorite coffee shop and get your coffee, you can't spend time with friends, maybe your movements are restricted, you can't go to your favorite outdoor spot. When all these things get taken away, do we see an increase or a change in symptoms of anhedonia? Do these things feel less appealing to us? Or is it just that we don't have access to them anymore? So yeah, with the repeated caveat of this is all very new, but we've started off running some of these trajectory models, looking at how these symptoms are changing over time. So the first thing that we looked at with this is trying to think about, okay, what is an overall trajectory going to look like during the pandemic? We have 12 months of data into 16 time points, because as I mentioned, we had slightly more dense sampling at the beginning. What is the trajectory that sort of overall best fits our data? So we were thinking initially about, a linear trajectory or quadratic trajectory. We tested a bunch of different models. If you're interested in the details, again, we've got a pre-registration up there on OSF. But this is our best fit model here, which was a piecewise model. So in thinking about the different ways that people's symptoms might have changed over time, we tested this piecewise model, which is basically a series of linear trajectories tied to different key dates. And the key dates that we put into this model are around the relative easing and introduction of new restrictions. So it's a slightly simplified version of what I showed you before, partly because you can't have, a different trajectory for every month. But for us, this first period here is kind of the first lockdown, which was began to be eased mid-June, a summer period of relatively eased restrictions, October to February then being kind of heading into our second wave. And then around February was when we in the UK got our roadmap to the way out of the pandemic. So these were kind of our key dates in terms of things that were really changing in people's environments. The other thing to mention about the October date, which I'll talk about again in a minute, is that this was a period where we were starting to talk about the second wave and introducing new restrictions, but it was also around the time that the first news about vaccines was coming out. Some of the first trials showing really good effects and plans starting to be put in place for a vaccine.
So it looks like a great model, but I just wondered that kind of long summer period.
Yes.
If you eyeball the data, there seems to be kind of a decreasing trend, right?
Yes, I would agree with that. And there's sort of, there's these three time points that are lower than the others.
So any idea why this ends up as a straight line rather than, is that just coming out of how the piecewise is done, or? Yeah,
so we defined all of our models before we ran any of these. So we could, we could split this into two trajectories and have a linear portion here and another kind of linear portion here. We didn't a priori specify that, so we haven't subsequently done that, but I would agree with you that this seems to be the poorest fit of our observed data.
Yeah, it seems that this 20th of October, that's strange that it gets up in that period anyway. Yeah. When did you lift the restrictions? Was that on the 20th of October?
The 20th of October was actually an introduction of worsening.
Sorry, that was the introduction of the worsening.
A sort of talk about second wave and threats of more restrictions, which came into place then in November and December for us.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so we had this piecewise model, which was our best fitting model for the overall trajectories. We then can decompose these trajectories into groups of individuals showing different patterns. So they're all modeled, as you can see, kind of, the October time point makes it most obvious, I think, in this piecewise way. But the slopes of each of these periods could vary across groups. So again, a data-driven way, we ran up to models of up to 7 classes. So 7 different lines of groups of different individuals, but the 4-class model was the best overall fit for our data. And we can also look at what proportion of people are following each, in our sample, are following each of these trajectories. So to take you through this just a little bit, the class 1 here is this green line, which is 10% of our sample showing high stable symptoms really throughout the course of the pandemic. We do see, of course, some changes over these different periods, but they're, hovering around the threshold for between moderately severe and severe depression on this PHQ-9 scale. Around 60% of our sample are, somewhat surprisingly to us, in a low stable group. So we know this is a group overrepresented in terms of people with prior mental health problems, but 60% of our people, of our participants during the pandemic were in this below the cutoff for mild depression. We then have our 2 more varying groups, the class 3 and class 4 groups, shown here in blue and in red. So the blue sample, the blue proportion is 17% of individuals who seem to be showing a sort of general increase up until this October time point, after which they start to show a decrease in symptoms again. Whereas the red group are doing something pretty opposite to that. They maybe have an initial peak. So of course we started assessing during the pandemic, so perhaps they're having initial reaction to the restrictions. They seem to then decrease in symptoms over the summer until this sort of announcement of a second wave. We see an increase in their symptoms again, sort of decreasing over the last couple of months. So what we think might be differentiating these two groups is that the blue line is perhaps a group of individuals who are more affected by the kind of global existential threat of the pandemic. And once news of a vaccine is announced, there's a sort of general slow decline after that. Whereas the red line might be people who are more affected by their immediate surroundings. The initial restrictions show this peak. There's, you know, kind of easing off of symptoms over the summer, and then it gets worse again with the introduction of new restrictions. Be delighted to hear any of your thoughts on this. This is our kind of first guess. A few other things to show you, and then maybe we can talk about that.
Do you know the demographic breakdown of these little groups?
Yes, I'm going to get to that too. That's a very helpful question though at this point. So just to show you our other models briefly, this is our anxiety symptoms model, very similar pattern overall to the depression group. We expect that we do see very high correlations between PHQ-9 and GAD-7 anyway, but somewhat notably that now we have 70% of our sample who are below the threshold for mild anxiety at every time point. The Anhedonia trajectories are somewhat more complicated and a very surprising 67% in a high stable trajectory of anhedonia symptoms, which I think is, we could talk about if there's time at the end, but partly in relation to the scale that we used for this. So around a third of the sample in our kind of low stable symptoms of anhedonia, and then a much smaller proportion of individuals showing any variation across the pandemic. So 2% of the sample in each of these three additional groups, which seem to be doing something a little bit more complicated. If anyone wants to talk about this, I'd be delighted, but I want to go on and show you some of the regressions and thinking about exactly your question about who's falling within each of these groups. So yes, regression analyses. I apologize for the formatting of some of these. These were just finished last week and we haven't quite finessed everything, but I'm going to show you a series of forest plots. I just want to sort of take you through them step by step. So again, everything to the right-hand side of this black line now is it's greater likelihood of being in this group, which the one I'm showing you right now is the stable high group relative to a stable low group. Anything to the other side of that means that you're more likely to be in the stable low group than the stable high group. So the example here, this 71 to 75-year-old age group, you're less likely to be in the stable high symptom group than the stable low symptom group. Whereas 19 to 25-year-olds are more likely to be in a stable high symptom trajectory than the stable low symptom trajectory. Any of these where the confidence intervals aren't showing up is because we actually don't have reliable confidence estimates on these, so something to be finessed. So yeah, ignore some of these ones without the proper confidence intervals for now. So yeah, some effect of age within depression symptoms in that younger people do seem to be more likely to have stable high symptoms. Not a strong effect of female gender here, well, no effect of female gender. And starting to look at some of our employment variables, people who were, I'm struggling to see it here now on my screen, yes, the red dot here, this is people who are unemployed, were more likely to be in this stable high symptom trajectory. Some effects also if you were furloughed or decrease the amount of your employment during the pandemic.
Do you have any self-employed people, or where would they fall?
They would fall, so this is compared to being employed. Yeah. So we haven't differentiated self-employed versus, you know, employed by someone else. Yeah.
So if you're a young student, you have a really high risk of being in a stable high, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Which is not necessarily pandemic related, right? So yeah, we also included our various categories of prior mental health diagnoses. So again, unsurprisingly, if you have a previous diagnosis of depression, you're more likely to be in a high stable depression trajectory, which is not an exciting finding, but for us, very reassuring that this kind of model makes sense. So now looking at our, what I was calling an existential threat, sort of group, people who are maybe more responsive to the news of a vaccine, we actually see a somewhat similar pattern of demographic predictors. So again, we see this age effect where younger people seem to be more likely to be in an existential threat group than in a low stable symptom group. Again, also if you're unemployed, and some associations with mental health diagnoses as well. And surprisingly also true for the kind of situational people who are maybe reacting more to their immediate surroundings. So it's sort of, yeah, thinking about who is at risk for changing or heightened symptom levels, not necessarily here differentiating between the types of trajectories that you're more likely to fall on. This is a similar set of analyses for our anxiety symptoms now. Again, sort of very similar pattern of effects. Some nuanced differences, but we haven't fully kind of decomposed these yet. The only sort of slightly more striking one is the effect of female gender here is present in anxiety, but not in depression, just like we saw in our first set of analyses. Lastly, I'm just going to show you some of the findings from the Anhedonia trajectories, which, as I mentioned, are a little bit more complicated. So now we're looking at whether you're more likely to be in a stable low compared to the stable high category. So stable high was our largest group, so it becomes our reference group for these regression analyses. And somewhat surprisingly, we don't see much demographic predictors, much in terms of significant demographic predictors at all. There is an effect of female gender. So now, because we're on the left-hand side of this line, you're less likely to be in the stable low group if you're female compared to if you're male. Again, you're less likely to be unemployed, and you're less likely to have a depressive disorder diagnosis. Sorry, I've just flipped everything on you, and that's confusing. It's a similar set of findings. These are our other trajectories, which haven't come up with sort of good names for yet, but in terms of a kind of high but decreasing trajectory, lower increasing, or initially decreasing and then increasing, really showing that we don't have much power in terms of demographic predictors at all for any of these. Of course, there are smaller proportions of our sample than we saw in the other models, but it suggests that maybe demographics are not making a substantial difference in terms of the type of trajectory that you're likely to follow. So the sort of next main set of analyses that we'd be interested in pursuing is thinking about some of these modifiable risk factors, going back to this model that I talked about in terms of your individual types of thought patterns, the types of behaviors you've been engaging in, how are these affecting your emotions over the course of the pandemic? So thinking about some of our cognitive and behavioral measures that we have at each of these time points, how can we factor these into this model? Can we use those as predictors of different trajectory types? And does that perhaps explain some of the differences that we're seeing that aren't effectively modeled by our demographic predictors? So I'm going to wrap up there and leave a little time for questions or any other thoughts, but just as a kind of summary of what I've gone through today. In our data, we see no overall changes in symptoms of depression, anxiety, or PTSD, but we do see large individual differences in terms of those initial months of the pandemic, with risk factors being prior mental health diagnoses, being younger, being female, being unemployed, or being a student. I talked a little bit about a potential bias in retrospective reporting, and that perhaps underestimating past symptom severity might contribute to this experience of heightened psychological distress during the pandemic that isn't necessarily tied to an objective change in symptom severity. Although these kind of retrospective estimates might still be useful in estimating individual differences and risk analyses. We looked also at some variable trajectories of symptom change in anxiety and depression, around 15 to 30% showing non-stable trajectories, and much smaller, only 6% for Anhedonia, showing variable trajectories over the pandemic. And again, for depression and anxiety, some similar demographic predictors in terms of gender, age, employment, and prior mental health diagnoses. Whereas in Anhedonia, maybe some effects of gender and unemployment, but a lot still to explore. So finally, I'd like to thank all of my collaborators, including Christine, and the various other people who've been involved in all of these projects for the last year and a half. And thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be delighted to take any questions.